Okay. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining in on the Marine Institute Graduate Society Seminar Series. We meet every week on Wednesdays at noon. This is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can find almost all of our seminars over the past couple of years. Before we start, we do want to provide a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan, and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Now, please join us in welcoming Dr. Cynthia McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie graduated with her PhD from Texas A&M, a school that has a fantastic job board for environmental sciences, by the way. Dr. McKenzie is a local research scientist at DFO, where she's been working for nearly 20 years. Is that right?
A little over 20 years now, yeah, at DFO, yeah.
Yeah, wow. And her research is focused on understanding ecosystem health and the dynamics and impacts of threats like invasive species and harmful algal blooms. Some of the more prominent organisms that I had been reading about that she had worked on are the European green crab, mussels, and different kinds of invasive tunicates and harmful algae. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. McKenzie.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to speak to your group this lunchtime. And I'm always interested in talking to people about green crab, and I've spent an awful lot of time and effort on studying them, and I think I understand them at one point, and then something happens and I don't really understand it all. So it's always interesting and always something new. And so we have a wide variety of things. Let me share my screen here, and hopefully this will go ahead. And you should be seeing it now. You see that now?
Looks good. Yep.
We're good? Okay, thank you. Okay, so today I was going to talk about the impact of the invasive green crab, European green crab. It is, of course, from Europe, and so it is invasive. The Latin name is Carcinus maenus. And so I want to talk about the effect it had on the native species and the coastal habitats in Newfoundland. I do work at Fisheries and Oceans, and I'm the lead researcher on aquatic invasive species, and also the ICES chair for the working group on introduction and transfer of marine organisms. So that also has to do with the movement of invasive species around from different places. So this is a lovely picture of, we have more green crab than pretty much anywhere else in the world. We're sort of like the green crab central here. They've really come in and really had a great old time and to stay. Let me try again. What did I do? There we go. So obviously I don't do all this myself. I've been working on invasive species for about 15 years or so now. And so these are the people who have worked with me now and have worked with me in the past. Philip Sargent, Megan Muse, Haley Lambert, Mike Piersack, Tizu, and Sally Faulkner, and also other people. Those are the people from my lab who are working with me directly, and then also do collaborative work with Kyle Matheson, Lynn Lush, Mac Parent, Bob Gregory, Ian Bradbury, and Sarah Leonard. Graduate students we've had quite a few graduate students over the time. Kaylee Brennan, who started out with me as a work term years ago, is now pretty much close to finishing up her master's thesis on green crab. And so also you may have known Jonathan Bergstoff and Nicole Zegapur, who also were at the Marine Institute working on green crab trapping and their impact on lobster. So there's quite a few people still who are working on things, but I just wanted to point out that this is not a sole effort, and I have lots and lots of people. Obviously, the picture of the people on the boat there, pre-COVID days, back when we actually could have large, surveys and things. And then the picture on the bottom right-hand corner is everybody getting together on a dock, and we were actually tagging green crab and Placentia Bay at that time. Also, according with people, we also have worked with other people within Fisheries and Oceans Canada and other people at the Memorial University, the Provincial Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Aquaculture. We have industry partners with NIA for aquaculture and the FFAW. We do a lot of work now with SIGA and eDNA Tech doing genetic identification and meta-barcoding for invasive species and harmful algae. We work a lot with First Nations, particularly the Halapu on the West Coast, and work a lot with ACAP, Humber Arm on the West Coast as well. And a lot of work with the harbor authorities and towns, because it's all, a lot of the work we do is coastal, and we involve the communities as much as we can for these. Okay, there's 3 things I'd really like for you to focus on as we talk about this. The invasion. I'll be talking mostly about the impacts, but there's a certain bit of that needs to be said before that. I want to highlight the fact that there's a separate invasion from warm and cold populations, and then they have hybridized. And so the differences between these warm populations and the cold populations and these hybrids have an effect on how they impact different things, how they move, what kind of habitats they like, and basically how invasive they can be. The impact, I'm going to focus a lot on that today. There have been impacts both on the south and west coasts, where we have green crab in Newfoundland. Basically, they predate on commercial and recreational shellfish. You know, their preferred food would be scallops and mussels and that sort of thing. So they're very keen on that. They certainly have an effect on that native clam beds. And then predation and competition with commercial fisheries, in particular lobster fishery. We're seeing more and more impact in that. And then basically the destruction of ecologically and biologically significant habitat, which would mostly be eelgrass. So I'll talk about each of those different things, the research that we've done to demonstrate these impacts. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the mitigation and what trapping studies have been done to provide this information to hopefully control or try to control to certain levels these impacts. Okay, the European green crab is one of the most invasive, top of the list. I've heard one of the top 10 invasive species in the world. This is because they are global invaders. They're tolerant to vast changes in salinity and temperature. They are prolific in their reproduction. Kylie Best, who was also a graduate student with me with the Marine Institute, did a lot of work on the reproduction of green crab. They certainly outcompete native species who are just not used to the idea of having this kind of crab around. They're voracious in their predation, and they will eat pretty much anything. We've had people who are doing trapping, everything between, moose meat to cod frames to, they will pretty much eat almost anything. And they are ecosystem engineers in that they can totally change a habitat with their presence. Just a little bit about their invasion. They are European, as the name implies. The first set of green crab that came into North America came in the early 1800s with ballast water. And basically, this is a warm-tolerant population I want to talk about. And it started in New England and basically moved north. This is the population also that is found on the West Coast. It started out a little bit about how they move around. Usually it's through ballast water in ships. But what happened in California and San Francisco is they were bringing in some bait, and they had packed the bait in seaweed, and in among the seaweed was green crab. And so when they took out the bait, they just threw the seaweed on the coast, and then of course the green crab just scurried away, and now they're making their way north into Washington, and they've been in BC for some time. So that's the same population that would go on the West Coast. It's found in other areas throughout the world. one other point I wanted to mention is that there's a cold tolerant population of European green crab, and that's in Norway and Iceland. So this shows you a little bit about the coastal spread on the Atlantic. As I said, it started out in the early 1800s with ballast water, and it basically moved north until it got to about mid Nova Scotia, and then really the temperature was just too cold. And the cold winters they would have would really break them back, and so they just really got too much faster than that. But along about the mid 1990s or so, a new population came in. This was a cold tolerant population from either Iceland or Norway, and this spread around, and this is what we found in Newfoundland in the first findings in 2007 in Placentia Bay. This is some work that was done by Blakely et al. In 2010. This is right after we had the first detection of the green crab. And so the samples that we had sent off. We did a comparison between where they were found in other areas. And you can see that what we have in our region is actually a hybridized version of the green crab. And they're actually even more aggressive and have more impact than either one of the southern or northern groups. You can see on the pie chart, the red ones are basically the warm tolerant populations, and the ones on the that are in the northern areas of Nova Scotia, those would be the related to the northern ones. But then you sort of see this mingling and hybridization. And in actual fact, what we think is that the population in Placentia Bay started out in about Halifax and was brought over through domestic ballast water. So a little bit more information about that. You can see how there was a paper that we put together. Sarah Leonard was the lead on this, where we were talking about the different temperature regimes of these different species. And you'll notice that in Newfoundland specifically, you'll see that on the west coast of Newfoundland, it's actually the more pure cold tolerant species. But if you look at Placentia Bay and Fortune Bay, you'll see that it is actually the hybrid population. And this has all sorts of impact for how aggressive they are, what kind of habitat they enjoy, and that sort of thing. I want to point out that the West Coast ones are also closely related to what you would find in the Magdalen Islands or in PEI. And so, you know, you imagine the low, shallow water. And that's sort of what you would find on the West Coast, but in our area, it's deeper, more crowded, and that sort of stuff. So one thing, when you're talking about management, and if you're working with DFO, ultimately, a lot of these questions deal with how do you manage various things, and in this case, aquatic invasive species. So you need to understand the environmental threshold with different kinds of genetic lineages, to see how that would affect where they move and how they impact the environment and that sort of stuff. So let's look at a map of Newfoundland. So if you start with 2007 in the upper left corner, you'll see that really, when we first were looking at them, we're looking at the North Harbor and Come By Chance, where the stars are. Those are the ones where the samples were taken for the genetic testing. But you'll see that really it was focused up in the northern area of Placentia Bay with just a few little ones to the side. And, you know, over there by Davis Cove, for example, you would only find 4 or 5 green crab at a time. And even in North Harbor, it was, you know, 100 or so. But when we first started doing, the next year when we started doing some mitigation, you know, they would come out with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of green crab at a time, and that was in 2007. So if you want to fast forward then to 2020, which is the last map that we have, you'll see how it's spread all over Placentia Bay, all over Maraschino Island, has now moved into St. Mary's Bay. When we were talking about that, we were talking to a fellow who reported it, and turns out, of course, he's a scallop dragger and does a lot of scallop dragging in Placentia Bay. And it's probable that in the course of moving his gear from Placentia Bay to St. Mary's Bay, he may have brought some hitchhikers along with him, and now they're in St. Mary's Bay. The populations that are in Placentia Bay are very similar to the populations that are now in Fortune Bay, and you'll see that they're gradually covering that area as well. It's had quite a bit of impact on the eelgrass in the area, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I just want to give you an idea of where they were now. And I also wanted to mention that they're as far north on the west coast as Port Saunders. But again, keeping in mind the ones on the west coast and the south coast are a different, warmer, the pure cold tolerant population. So I should mention that they were going along. They're actually moving along the coast, and so the question became: are they moving from the Fortune Bay population? Are they moving west, or are they moving east from the Bay St. George western population? So I've been working with Zizou, who is working with us on the genetic populations of green crab and the invasion and how it is working. And so he did some sequencing of the different populations from Seal Cove and Burgeo and Rose Blanche and those areas, just to see which direction it was heading. And it certainly looks like that the green crab moving along the south coast are in fact the western cold tolerant population moving east, and presumably some point in there they will mix together and hybridize again. So that's the information. We're continuing some more work on other populations to basically track, how this has changed and how it's likely to change. Another project, which I'll talk about in a minute, has to do with telemetry and acoustic tracking, and we're comparing the different populations with this tracking from the west coast and the south coast. So I mentioned before that the green crab were quite popular, or quite very fond of clam beds. This is a picture of a clam bed from North Harbor, and you can see how the devastation has happened with the clams. You can actually tell that a green crab has been after them, because if you look at it, they sort of snap the clam with their claws, and then they stick their claws in and pull out the meat. And so they basically can go through quite a bit of clams and clam beds, natural clam beds, pretty fast. So this was in a year or two that they completely destroyed the clam bed in North Harbor. And so we did a study, Kyle Matheson and myself, on predation in sea scallops. The reason this came about was we were getting phone calls from fish harvesters finding lots and lots of empty, smaller scallop shells in North Harbor, and so we wanted to see what they were more likely to eat, and they were very, very fond of smaller scallops, and so they were certainly impacting the future of the scallop industry, in that a lot of the early scallops were being destroyed. They also enjoy mussels. Shellfish is their preferred diet, but they eat lots of other things. Worms and even small fish, they can catch them, and juvenile lobster as well. We found some that had juvenile lobster in their gut content. Which leads me to the lobster studies that we've had. I mentioned before that Nikki and had been working on the impact of green crab on lobster. And so she did some work in Fortune Bay. It was early on, and so we found not that many much of an impact yet, but now we're finding more and more. What we find is that as the green crab increase in numbers, they displace the lobster and then probably do go ahead and eat. I'll speak a little bit more about the project that we're doing now about the impact of green crab on lobster in a bit. They also outcompete the native species. In Newfoundland, the native species is a rock crab. You can see on the right side, there's a picture of the green crab and the rock crab. The rock crab is below the picture. And so green crab certainly impact and displace, eat rock crab. That's actually one of the ways that we can tell how far the invasion has gone based on how many rock crab are still around. Sometimes the larger ones just go deeper. Sometimes the green crab prey on them as well. And if they're in the same trap, the rock crab doesn't have a chance. As I mentioned before, Kylie Best had done some work on the reproductive biology. And so as we're discovering in some areas that as we fish out green crab, we're finding the reproduction or the production of eggs getting smaller and smaller. On the West Coast in particular, we found that, they were less than 30 millimeters and they were producing eggs. When we first started, it was closer to 35 or so. We thought we were pretty safe at 35, but now it's even smaller than that. Now we'll speak a little bit about eelgrass. We found there's a lot of anecdotal reports about eelgrass being impacted. People would talk to us about how they were finding eelgrass floating around or washed up on the shoreline, and in the summer, which is not something that usually happens. And so we fortunately, Kyle Matheson and ourselves found some information or found some data from some previous work, which I'll go into in a minute, that had done some studies of eelgrass in Placentia Bay before green crab arrived. And so that allowed us to go back to these locations and check to see what kind of impact we had. So this is where the study began. This was some work done by Robichaud and Rose in 2006. They had looked at 23 sites in Placentia Bay, 23 sites in Placentia Bay, 21 with eelgrass, with beach seining and surveys and that sort of stuff, and underwater video and transects, lots and lots of information about the eelgrass and what fish were found in them. And so, but the important part, or the beauty part of this is before green crab were found in Placentia Bay. So what happened? You had a opportunity then to do a bocce design where you had an area that was pre-green crab and then post-green crab. And so that's what we did. And so this is where we originally they were started. And this is how far that they had arrived, they'd gone to at the time. So several of these locations is where we did the study. And so they had different locations. And so when we did the analysis, you could see the areas where you had green crab with the coverage of eelgrass in certain areas versus the coverage afterwards from 1998 to 2012, after we'd had the various invasions, because it was not equally invaded around Placentia Bay. It had various areas. So you'll notice on the right panel that it was a significant difference. And so the details of this are in that paper, of course, but I think the visual is actually quite a bit more startling. And so what we found was that in Placentia Sound in 1998, and by 2012, it was pretty much devastated. Same way with Southern Harbor, Swift Current. Most of there was a decline, sometimes 80% at 4 sites. But again, it depended on the kind, how the green crab invasion was. Swift Current is a large area, and it still has a lot of eelgrass in some areas, but the areas which were studied previously, when we went back and looked at the very same place, we discovered that they were definitely, the eelgrass was definitely gone. And so there was no doubt then that the eelgrass had been affected by the green crab. We did a whole study of what else could it have been, but it was pretty clear that the eelgrass was affected. And that's actually one of the things that we look at now in Fortune Bay and other areas to see, the level of the invasion. So I mentioned that we knew we'd had quite a bit of trapping with green crab, and green crab would found in lobsters. In lobster traps, actually, I get more phone calls from lobster harvesters saying that they found green crab in traps, and that's how we do a lot of our early detection. Is they contact us and let us know that this is an issue. So what we wanted to know was outside of the traps, what's going on. And so what we did was we have been tracking green crab. We did some earlier studies with temperature in females to see where they were going. And so we sort of expanded this then. And so what we have these receivers that we place around in a location in an array, and then we tag the lobster and the green crab with these devices. And so it pings off these various things, and we can tell exactly where they are. In the bottom left is an example of what the results would be, and it shows that the green crab are along the around the shoreline, as they are shore crabs, and then the lobster a little bit deeper, but there is quite a bit of movement in between. And so in one area that we're doing this with, this is from this area here. It's a fairly small area, but we're also doing another area up here where it's a little bit more open, and so we can track. When we first started this in 2017, there weren't very many green crab there. Now we're finding some. And so, but we're also tracking what the lobster are doing as well. And so this is a project that we have. It's a Canadian Science Research Fund within DFO. So we can, and we're going to do this until 2024. And so we can track not only in Fortune Bay, as I mentioned, it was the hybrid population, but also on the Bay of Islands with our colleagues at ACAP and do some studies in Goose Cove there, and look into what we find in that area. So that's the project we're going to do. That was over in the Bay of Islands. So to summarize, they are global invaders, as we've shown. They do tolerate vast salinity and temperature changes. They are prolific in reproduction. They have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 eggs per female green crab. They certainly outcompete native species. They're voracious predators with a broad diet, and they're definitely ecosystem engineers, totally redoing the habitat, particularly eelgrass. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've tried to do and what studies we've conducted to get to try to control some of these impacts. And so what we see are some studies over the years. The truck there at the Bic is one of the earlier attempts. We thought we were going to have in the neighborhood of several hundred green crab in 2008, but it turns out to be thousands. And so we thought we were going to put them in our freezer at DFO, but we ended up having to go out and run a freezer from Atlas Freezers because we just had so many we couldn't even deal with it. So over the period of time, we've worked with the fish harvesters and other people who are interested in stewardship and removal of green crab. And so we've been doing this for many, many years. And so some of these studies have shown some impact. This is a project we did in St. Joseph's and in Boat Harbor in 2014 and 2015, where we found that intense trapping, and when I say this, we're talking 30 traps twice a day, every day, for weeks. And so eventually the numbers did go down, and what we found in the next year was that it would come back up again as the younger ones took over again, but it would go eventually down further again. Again, this depends totally on how open or closed the system is. We chose systems that were fairly closed, but in some areas, particularly North Harbor, for example, Swift Current, it's completely open, and basically they can just move in again. So that's one of the problems with trying to mitigate, is that it's not a closed system, and you really you can work on some impact, but then there's a risk that not only would the younger ones grow up, but also you're seeing movement around the bays in these open areas. We've done some studies. Jonathan Bergshoff did several studies using cameras and Fukui traps, basically to see how effective the Fukui trap was. Other groups in Canada working with DFO have done this as well. This is an example of the Fukui trap, which is the standard trap in Newfoundland. We order them from Japan. They have slits on the side here where the green crab would go through, and you have a bait jar up here, or if you're just doing it for a short period of time, a bait sack. Usually we use either herring or cod frames, but as I mentioned, they pretty much eat anything. And so, but cod frames to be one of their favorite because it smells and it covers distance. So this is what the Fukui Trap looks like. And so as more people were concerned about mitigation and trapping across Canada, we were asked to provide some advice. And we led this National Science Advice. It's National CSAS, which is the Canadian Secretariat for Advice, on trapping methods for invasive green crab in Canada. And so that was myself and our lab here, but also colleagues from across Canada, Renee Bernier from Gulf, Natalie Simard, Quebec, and Tom Terrio from BC. And so basically we looked at the different kinds of traps. Again, we have the Fukui Trap, the eel trap, the minnow trap, whale traps, modified crab traps, and this is called a Russell trap, which they use in Nova Scotia. It doesn't collapse or anything like the Fukui does. The Fukui is quite nice because it collapses. You can put 20 or 30 in a boat and deploy them pretty fast. They are, though, lightweight, and it's kind of tricky to, you have to make sure that they're well grounded if you have a big currents or anything. So we did a comparison of these traps to see, in what circumstances. As I said, we use most of the Fukui traps here. At one point we started out with the conical traps, but we moved swiftly to the other ones because these were heavy and they didn't really stack all that well. And so we sort of have moved now then nationally to this one. So the science advice was designed to review the gear that had been used for trapping aquatic European green crab in the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and seeing, if you have a specific goal, which one should be using and that sort of thing, and looking at live stages and bycatch and catch per unit effort, or how much effort it takes to catch a certain amount of green crab. So based on this review, we provided recommendations on the gear type for trapping and considering the feasibility and logistics of which ones. We're in the process now of finishing this up for advice on this. And one thing that we did was identify the knowledge gaps regarding trapping, and I'll speak to that in a second. But it all sort of boiled down to critical questions about trapping. What is the objective? Are you trying to totally remove it? Are you trying to take it down to a certain threshold level? Why are you doing it? And also, how is that to relate to the target population? Are you looking at males, females, young, that sort of thing? You need to know exactly who you're aiming for. How will trapping be conducted? Is it shore-based? Are you doing it off of a small boat? Larger vessels, who will be doing it? We found working with the fish harvesters that, they do really well offshore, but a lot of this work can be done from shore because, again, they are shore crabs. So you can do it off the shore. You can do it off of a dock. They love being around docks because that's where people have a tendency to throw out their waste for the fishery. And so that's often the first place we'll look for them is around wharves and docks, because that's where the dinner bell is basically going on. And then again, what are the potential unexpected consequences? What else are you catching in this? And then areas and protected areas and that sort of stuff. So you want to be careful about the bycatch, that you're not collecting some things that you didn't want to be collecting in your quest to get rid of as many green crab as you can. So considerations, what is the goal? Are you trying to control the impact? You need to know a threshold level. I mean, how many do you need to have before it impacts eelgrass or before it impacts lobster? Is the location open or closed? As I said, it's much easier to do in closed location because you have some hope that you're not having them come back from a different direction. Is the habitat rocky or flat? The sediment type, they seem to love what is considered in Newfoundland called puck mud. And so it's kind of this sucking mud, and they love to dig in it because it's a sediment that's easy, and they have lots of worms, and this is where the eelgrass is often located. They don't actually go after the eelgrass so much, is that they are in the process of digging looking for food or burying themselves that they're disrupting eelgrass. They can eat it sometimes, and there are videos of them eating it, but it's not their usual plan. It's basically just as they're digging, they tear it up. Biological considerations when you're trapping, you need to think about what the season is. They're definitely the high season for the largest number of crabs would be in August, September. The spatial areas, you'd think that one area, it's certainly not a well spread area. There are definitely patchy areas depending on where they are. If there's a clam bed nearby, they love it. Mussel beds nearby. They really like also a freshwater inflow, the females in particular, and juveniles. And then as they get older, then they tolerate a higher salinity. There's concerns about bycatch. And then, of course, bait type. As I said, they will pretty much come to anything, but there are some preferences. Then you have questions about the effort and duration of the trapping. Are you going to try to hit it really hard? Or are you going to try to do it long and slow? And it's a balance. It really is difficult. The life stages, are you trying to get the adult ones? Are you trying to get the females? The hydro effect is something that also comes up. And this is why you need a sustained trapping effort for a long period of time, because they are cannibalistic. And so what happens is as you take the larger ones out, the younger ones then survive and explode in the population. So, you know, by taking out the larger ones that were preying on the smaller ones, you're having an undesired effect there. And so what we find too when we're putting traps is that if a large green crab is in the trap, then a female and or smaller ones will not go into it because they know that they wouldn't survive. Then they had the entire question about the utilization of all this biomass you're pulling out. I was talking to Colin earlier, talking about how we've tried various things, everything between fertilizer and so it didn't go to a landfill. But on the other hand, the cost of moving around this massive green crab is quite expensive. And so it's actually almost prohibitive to do almost anything with it because of the transportation cost. You have the motivation of the people who are trying to do the trapping. Are they being paid to do it? Are they doing it out of stewardship to protect their resource? Are they doing it out of is a community that's concerned about the broader environmental effects? Then you can look at the measures of success. You have people typically think of reduced numbers, but really the size reduction is also important because, as I said, what you can find is as you take out more and more of the large ones, what you start finding is smaller crabs in the traps. And also what you start finding is the return of native species. Some of the places we've done a lot of heavy intensive trapping, you'll find that the rock crab are back and doing better. And then you can find the impact reduction on in general on habitats and eelgrass. So the one thing I wanted to point out was we talked about highlighting two things that were knowledge gaps. And so one of these two things were the threshold levels, knowing how many green crab per square meter is important, whether you are trying for lobster, protecting eelgrass. That's not really known. I mean, is it 3? Is 3 okay? Is 10 okay? You know, we don't really know that. We've done several studies on it, but it's still really difficult to say. And again, the life stages. We've done a lot of trapping, and it's been also mostly for adults. And there have been some work in Washington State, and also BC, where they're trying to do some trapping using minnow traps for juveniles. But again, it's a little bit tricky, and the juveniles don't really come very well to traps as a general rule. Nope. What did I do? I'm not sure where there we are. Okay, so we're about to the 3 points to remember. I'm going to wrap up here with this. So basically, we had separate invasions. There was warm and cold tolerant populations, the hybridized
Not sharing your
population.
screen anymore.
No, I'm not.
Sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I was wondering what was going on. Let me see what I can do here. I'm almost done. So let's see if we can. Huh, I don't know what happened with that.
So
One moment, please.
okay, so are you on the share content section?
I seem to have closed my presentation somehow. One moment, please. There we go. Now can you see it?
Yep, got it now.
Perfect. Okay. So I really only have 2 more slides here. So let me move rapidly through the review. So, as I said, so you can see this now, right? You're good?
Yeah, we got it now.
Perfect. Okay. So briefly, there's there's the warm and cold tolerant or north and south populations and the hybridization. We have ongoing studies for that. There are impacts both on the south and western Newfoundland, predation on commercial and recreational shellfish, and then predation and competition with commercial fishing, particularly lobster. And so we're doing these ongoing telemetry studies, both on the west and the south, to look at the different hybridized, different populations. We've done quite a bit of work on ecological and biological significant habitats with eelgrass, and then we're also providing trapping advice for trapping green crab across North America. And that's it. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah, if anybody has a question, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call you out, and you can turn your video on if you want, or you can just write a question in the chat and I'll read it, or Cynthia can read it. So we got one from Arno. Go ahead, Arno.
Yeah. Hi, Cynthia. Thanks for the talk.
Hi there.
Learned a lot again. I have a question. The slide shows a reduction in catch rate in both harbor.
Yeah, Spain Harbor. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
And
so that was in 2014. Yeah, go ahead.
On the x-axis, you had like number 5, 10, 20, 25. I wasn't sure exactly what were those numbers. Like, are they days of fishing? And then, of course, my phone has to ring at that time. Anyway, yeah. So I wasn't sure what was those numbers, and I'm curious also, when was that fishing done? Was it done in July, August? And I'm asking that because trying to compare with a bit of Kelly's result, you start to observe.
Right. Yeah. No, it was definitely. Yeah, it was definitely in July and August. And it was actually over several. We'd actually contracted several fish harvesters to do that work, and so it was part of a larger project that Valet had funded. And so yeah, no, along there's this number of days, yes. And so it was a quite intense period. And so this is by kilogram. And so what this doesn't show is that as we did continue to do this over the 2 years, the size also changed to get quite smaller. And so, but again, yeah, it was, I forget exactly when it was, but it was certainly in the peak season, probably August, September. But again, it was, you know, like, I think it was like 30 traps twice a day, in a fairly small area though. I mean, it was, and we left it up to the fish harvesters, what bait to use, because we had all told them to use herring, but then we came along and someone was getting a lot better catch rate than the others, and so they were using cod frames, and so then we said, okay, yeah, if you want to use cod frames, because the whole point was to get more out. So so yeah, but no, the short answer to your question is yes, it was during the high period of, you know, certainly July, August, possibly September, but in the summer. And then but yeah, no, it's days, fishing days along the bottom.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Has anybody played around with, I'm not sure if this really makes sense for population suppression, but has anyone ever tried to like keep maybe just females and or maybe just females and small males in any of these places where it's invasive and they're trying these methods out?
Well, in 2008, we did an intense trapping for all species. I mean, for all males and females. But what they discovered was that there was a certain time of the year that you could find the females, because what happens is the females hold their eggs, and then they won't come into the traps. But if they do, then they once they've released their eggs, then they will come into the traps. So you have this period of time where you're only getting males, and then once the larvae are released, then they would, it's usually about late August or so, then you start finding a mix in the in things. But
So you're
but
not
the
really
next
getting
year,
rabid females.
well, that's the thing. The next year, in 2009, they actually targeted gravid females. But the problem with that is they don't really come to the traps very much because they're protective. What we found, actually, it's better, rather than using bait, was to use cover,
Yeah, I
sea
was gonna say
grasses and
shelter.
things like that. Yeah, because then they would know the shelter, and so that would be the way it works better. So
Interesting. Yeah, cool. So and with that, I'm assuming there's not really a lot of bycatch in these, just because they're so voracious. Like they're the first to the trap, I'm assuming.
yeah, they're first to the trap for sure. If there's something else in there, it doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
Even the smaller ones. I mean, we've had some, you know, everything between cod and flounder and other things that, you know, it's like piranha in a way, really. The only thing that stands a chance is cunners. Cunners have a really good thick skin, so they actually can survive. But the others, it doesn't work out well at all. And we've actually had fish harvesters tell us that the lobster in a trap would be devoured in the trap by green crab, just because there were just so many in there, could just tear it up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's it depends, I guess, what goes in there first and that sort of thing. But we've certainly found that they're not going in if there's large crabs already there. Females won't go in.
Okay.
Anyway, so yeah, but that's an indication of how it's going. If you're starting to find, because we've been doing some stuff in North Harbor, we've been doing long lines in North Harbor for ever since they were there, and ever since the Marine Institute had finished worked on their mitigation and recovery of eelgrass, what we found in our trap was a smaller number of green crab, and we're actually beginning to see more of the native species, the rock crab, back again.
Yeah, that makes
That's
sense.
in North
And
Harbor,
I'm
yeah.
assuming you can probably bait it with something that maybe the rock crab, don't really care about, but green crab are like anything, anything's on the plate, on the menu.
I don't know, I haven't really given a whole lot of thought to what rock crab prefer the most.
Sure.
But I do know that lobster are having, certainly at the first, we're having a big problem with seeing green crab as food, because they're not used to things that would display back at them. And so green crab will come at you. Smallest little green crab will just come at you and just like it's trying to kill you. And the lobster just didn't know what to do with that at all. And so, people often say, well, you should use green crab for lobster. But they don't seem to recognize it at all as food.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I see there are a few other questions if you want to.
Yeah. I was just about to say, Bob, do you have a question?
I do. There's been a lot of work done on green crab over the years. So the main question I have, it's always been a curiosity for me ever since I heard of eradication type projects in Nova Scotia, Antigonish Harbor, and places like this. Is it worth it? And I want to focus that question a little bit more, considering the amount of effort that's spent on removal of green crab and the rather mixed results in trying to do so. Is this really productive, or should we simply monitor the effect of green crab in the environment, say there's nothing we can do about it, and simply monitor the invasion as it's occurring and as it moves forward in time?
Well, Bob, I've been conflicted about that for a long time. but I think, and people have mentioned that to me, and they've specifically said, well, maybe we can wait for an equilibrium or something like that. But I hope I've shown that the impact is so great on eelgrass and lobster and shellfish and the habitats that they invade, that eradication is not going to happen. But there is quite a bit of effort on control. You could compare it, for example, to Asian carp, or the amount of money spent on things in the Great Lake, invasive species in the Great Lake. It's millions of dollars, and really, in fact, we haven't really spent anywhere near that on green crab. There are some areas where it's fully invaded. Newfoundland is actually one of the few places where we really should make an effort through prevention of spread through gear and other things, so it doesn't approach the northern areas where it hasn't been yet. It still has an awful lot of spots to go to, and so I'm certainly not a supporter of giving up and just documenting what happens. I think the impact is too great. It's quite devastating to the fisheries and the habitat. So, and trapping is not really that expensive compared to a lot of things. We've tried to get some idea of what utilization could be done to help offset the cost. But as yet, we haven't really found anything that was good for that. But I think the short answer to that is, I think that the impact is too great to just sort of sit back and let it pervade. If you want to do a comparison of, in the Maritimes area where they had the green crab there for a long time, didn't really have much of an impact on the lobster or the eelgrass. And that was the warmer species, and that really didn't have much of an impact. But now that you have this hybrid that's going into areas that were there before, suddenly they're finding devastating eelgrass, they're finding lobsters being affected. And so this hybridized version is very, very destructive and has quite a bit of impact. And so even in areas where green crab have been for a long, long time, they're finding this hybrid is having, unexpected impacts that, have long-term consequences.
There
you go.
is another aspect of this which I don't think gets a lot of airplay, and that is your typical invasive species. And you can talk about starlings, you can talk about Eurasian milfoil, you can talk about green crab. Is when you have an invasion front coming through, you have a very high productivity of the invasive species. Behind that wave, it settles into a, I hate to say it, a new normal. So could we be dealing with that as well? And actually by constantly eradicating or attempting to eradicate, and you've already shown that that is very tough, that you may actually stretch out the amount of the high impact phase of the invasion. This is the sort of thing that happened when we foolishly tried to eradicate spruce budworm, for example. Basically, we lengthened the invasion out by decades rather than just let it run its course and be done with it. Yeah, have you thought of any of that sort of example?
Well, even when we're trying to do the mitigation in Placentia Bay, the question has always been, do we try to do something on the event front before the impact has really taken hold, or do we try to go to areas which has had the most impact already? The thing is, it's not like, because we've looked at North Harbor for a very, very long time. And, within a few years, there was nothing left there except for green crab and a few snails. And so I'm not too clear on what they were eating. I think they were eating each other. And they move around from place to place. And so there was no indication, certainly in North Harbor, where there had been the longest, that any of this stabilization or recovery was taking place. And so that was, 15 years or so that, hopefully it would be stabilized by then. So, I hate to make the analogy here, but, if you compare it, for example, to COVID, if you have a high impact, high spreading thing, do you let it run its course, or do you try to control it? And again, it's, it's the management decision about whether it should be one thing or the other. So eradication really should never be used in an area that, that's not going to happen. That's why we're back to threshold levels. What threshold can you take it to without, so that you don't have the impact, the negative impact on lobster or the negative impact on eelgrass? I mean, do you need to take it down or fish it down to a point where it's 10 crab per whatever, but you certainly cannot eradicate. That will not happen, and I don't think anybody expects that. What we had hoped to do, and we've done in some cases, is we reduce the size so that the local predators would have an impact, and we're finding some of that as well, where the birds and the rock crab and the lobsters even are able to predate on the smaller size creatures or green crab. And so that's part of the mitigation strategy, is that if you have a smaller size class, then they may be preyed upon by a broader group. And so that's something that we've been looking at as well.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you. I think that's it for questions. Yeah, so my final question is kind of where do you see the future for this for green crab in Newfoundland? Is that just based on the management decisions that we take from here, or do you see it something more clearly happening with the green crab?
Well, I think as far as I'm concerned, in terms of research goes, we certainly wanted to have more information on what the impact is, because that, if you have demonstrated impact, then management decisions would change to a different way. And also, a lot of it is management. There's a lot of concern on the West Coast in Pacific region. And so, we've been fighting with, tracking green crab for some time here, trying to have some kind of impact. But nationally now, within DFO, I think it's got a broader concern. And so I'm hoping that there'll be more directed studies. Certainly in Newfoundland, as I mentioned before, we're to a point here where it's not all over the island. There's a lot of places that can be protected through management and, the vectors and the gear and that sort of thing, and keeping it from going from one place to the other. Natural spread is one thing. It's moving naturally along the South Coast. That's one thing. But any point-to-point movement into the, into Trinity Bay or into Notre Dame Bay, that sort of stuff, it would be nice if we could, prevent that. And I see Arnaud has another question.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Arnaud?
Yeah, actually, I have tons of questions, but it's past 1 o'clock. But one quick question. So, I mean, I do some work in Garnish and lots of green crab in Garnish on the Fortune Bay side. But I don't, I mean, the eelgrass still very healthy, lobster fishing quite good over there. So my question is, have you observed similar impact of green crab on the Fortune Bay side, now that they are here, that you have observed in the Placentia Bay side? The first question. And second part of the question is, what's the role of green crab? Or do you have a sense of the role of green crab in the difference in the lobster fishing between Fortune Bay and Placentia Bay, currently?
Okay, so I would say the biggest issue is that in Fortune Bay, it drops off quite more rapidly than in Placentia Bay. And so that where you have most of the green crab along the coast, it's only when the lobster move in into the coastal areas that they actually start interacting with the green crab. And so the big concern there is that if they are using some of these as lobster hatcheries, lobster juvenile areas, which is one of the studies that we're trying to do, it may not be a problem within the traps, but are the green crabs impacting the juvenile lobsters, which would be closer to the shore? And so, but that's the biggest difference really between Placentia Bay and Fortune Bay, is that we're finding just a different interactions of where their locations are. It's kind of harder to say because we could follow the Fortune Bay from the beginning, but Placentia Bay, the lobster catch had sort of declined already. And so it's really kind of hard to say how much of that was related to the green crab and how much was something else. Certainly the green crab did not help any kind of recovery from lobster. But I like to think that the mitigation that y'all did for the last 5 years has certainly increased the possibility of more lobster in Placentia Bay. But that's the difference now. I think what you're seeing is, since you don't have such a devastating effect yet, and there are certainly areas in Fortune Bay where the lobsters are being impacted and the eelgrass is washing up. So it's a very patchy situation, and so you're finding a lot of that in some places. But no, I think it's early yet in the invasion in Fortune Bay. And so as the green crab progress and take over more space, you're likely to find more impact.
Yeah, because my observation, it's only limited to Garnish in Fortune Bay, so, but in Garnish, the green crab seems to be very inside the estuary here, they are the harbor and inside there, because we developed, this collector for juvenile lobster outside, and we have no interaction with green crab just outside there, but inside it seems, anyway.
Yes.
Like you said, it might be like the space, the habitat used and the space used by green crab might be different between the two bays,
Yep. And so, and even within Fortune Bay, there's all sorts of different habitats and areas, and because we've done all sorts of trapping, and we've had other people with the FFAW doing, trapping around. And so, for example, Contra East, they're finding thousands and thousands of green crab there. And, you know, and we constantly get emails and calls from people that are finding green crab in their lobster traps. So there's certainly a lot of concern for the future, I think.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank
I
you.
will stop
Thank
with
you.
my question here.
Thanks.
All right. So I think that, thank you for staying a little bit longer than one. First of all, and I think that wraps it up for questions. Before I do end it, I do want to say thank you so much for the talk, Cynthia. I do want to introduce next week's seminar on Wednesday at noon. We have another local, Dr. Con Nguyen from DFO. He's a former PhD student here at the Marine Institute. He'll be giving a talk titled Changes of Gilbert Bay cod population after more than 20 years of monitoring. So I hope to see y'all then, and have a great Wednesday. Yeah, and thank you again for the talk, Cynthia.
Thank you. My pleasure.